What if I told you that America's greatest weakness isn't an enemy across the ocean, it's ignoring the ally right next door? While Washington obsesses over threats from Beijing and Moscow, there's a silent dependency that could determine whether the United States thrives or crumbles in the next decade. We're talking about resources, energy security, trade routes, and strategic geography that most Americans don't even think about. Canada isn't just our friendly neighbor. It's the lifeline that keeps our economy running, our homes powered, and our national security intact. Today, I will expose this myself, the hidden infrastructure of survival that connects these two nations in ways the mainstream media refuses to discuss. Jeffrey Sachs, one of the world's leading economists and geopolitical advisors, has been sounding the alarm about this critical relationship. And what he reveals will completely shift how you see North American power dynamics. This isn't about politics or patriotism. It's about the raw, undeniable facts of resource dependency, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the fragile systems that hold our modern civilization together. The truth is uncomfortable, but understanding it might be the most important thing you learn this year. Let me start by painting a picture that most Americans never consider when they think about their daily lives. Every time you turn on a light switch, fill up your gas tank, or even scroll through your phone, there's a silent partnership at work that makes it all possible. Canada supplies more oil to the United States than any other country in the world. Yes, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Venezuela, more than any OPEC nation you can name. We're talking about nearly 4 million barrels of crude oil crossing the border every single day. That's not just a statistic on a spreadsheet somewhere in Washington. That's the fuel that powers American trucks, heats American homes, and keeps American factories running around the clock. Without that steady flow of Canadian energy, the entire American economic machine would start grinding to a halt within weeks, maybe even days. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is something Jeffrey Sachs has been trying to make policymakers understand for years. The relationship between the United States and Canada isn't just about oil and gas, though that alone would be enough to make it critical. We're talking about a resource interdependency that touches almost every aspect of modern American life. Canada is the largest supplier of electricity to the United States, with power flowing across the border through an intricate grid system that most people don't even know exists. When Texas faced that catastrophic power crisis a few years back, it exposed just how vulnerable our energy systems really are. Meanwhile, states along the northern border have been quietly relying on Canadian hydroelectric power for decades, creating a safety net that keeps the lights on even when domestic systems fail. Then there's water, and this might be the most underestimated resource of them all. The Great Lakes system, which is shared between Canada and the United States, contains roughly 20% of the world's fresh surface water. In a world where water scarcity is becoming one of the defining challenges of the 21st century, that's not just valuable, it's potentially priceless. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee depend on this water for everything from drinking to industrial production. The treaties and agreements that govern how this water is managed and shared represent one of the most successful examples of international resource cooperation in human history. But here's the uncomfortable truth that Sachs points out. If that cooperation ever broke down, if political tensions ever escalated to the point where Canada decided to play hardball with water rights, the consequences for American cities and industries would be absolutely devastating. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't make headlines but should absolutely terrify anyone who understands supply chain economics. Canada is the United States' largest supplier of critical minerals and metals that are essential for everything from smartphones to military hardware. We're talking about uranium for nuclear power plants, potash for fertilizers that feed American agriculture, nickel and cobalt for electric vehicle batteries, and rare earth elements that go into advanced electronics and defense systems. As the United States tries to reduce its dependency on China for these critical materials, guess where it's turning? That's right. Canada has some of the largest untapped reserves of these strategic resources in the world. The irony here is almost painful when you think about it. American politicians give speeches about achieving strategic independence and reducing reliance on potential adversaries, but they rarely acknowledge that achieving those goals means becoming even more dependent on Canada. Sachs has spent decades studying global economic systems and geopolitical relationships. One of his core arguments is that Americans fundamentally misunderstand where their security and prosperity actually come from. We love to think of the United States as this self-sufficient superpower that doesn't need anyone else, but the reality is far more complex and interconnected. The Canadian economy is so integrated with the American economy that trying to separate them would be like trying to unscramble an egg. We're talking about supply chains where components cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. A car part might be made in Michigan, shipped to Ontario for additional processing, then sent back to Michigan for final assembly. This isn't inefficiency. It's actually a highly optimized system that leverages the strengths and specializations of both countries. The automotive industry alone employs millions of people across both nations, and it functions as a single integrated system rather than two separate national industries. When American politicians talk about bringing manufacturing back and reducing imports, they often seem to forget that a huge portion of what they're calling imports are actually parts and materials coming from facilities that American companies own or have partnered with in Canada. Breaking up this system wouldn't just be economically painful, it would be economically catastrophic for both countries. And here's the thing that Sachs emphasizes. Canada knows this, but they also know that the dependency runs both ways. The United States needs Canadian resources and manufacturing capacity, but Canada needs American markets and investment capital. It's a symbiotic relationship that has created one of the most prosperous economic zones in human history. But let's shift gears and talk about something even more critical: military and strategic security. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, better known as NORAD, is a joint military organization between the United States and Canada that monitors and defends the airspace over both countries. This isn't just some symbolic partnership. It's an operational military integration that most Americans don't even realize exists. Canadian and American military personnel work side by side, sharing intelligence, coordinating responses to potential threats, and maintaining a defensive perimeter that protects the entire continent. If you're sitting in New York or Los Angeles, or anywhere in between, Canadian military forces are part of the reason you can sleep safely at night. The early warning systems, radar installations, and fighter jet bases scattered across the Canadian Arctic are the first line of defense against any potential threats coming over the North Pole. And speaking of the Arctic, this brings us to what might be the most important geopolitical dimension of the U.S.-Canada relationship for the future. Climate change is opening up the Arctic in ways that seemed like science fiction just 20 years ago. New shipping routes are becoming navigable. Vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals are becoming accessible. And suddenly, this frozen frontier is turning into one of the most strategically important regions on the planet. Russia is already militarizing its Arctic territories, building bases, and deploying forces in preparation for what many analysts believe will be a new era of Arctic competition. China, despite being nowhere near the Arctic, has declared itself a near-Arctic nation and is investing billions in Arctic research and development. In this emerging great game, Canada's Arctic sovereignty becomes absolutely crucial for American security interests. If Canada can't or won't defend its Arctic territories, if other powers start making claims or establishing presences in the Canadian Arctic, the strategic implications for the United States would be profound. Sachs argues that American foreign policy has become dangerously myopic, focusing on distant conflicts and ideological competitions while neglecting the foundational relationships that actually matter for long-term prosperity and security. We spend trillions on military operations halfway around the world, but how much attention do we pay to ensuring that our relationship with Canada remains strong, stable, and mutually beneficial? The answer is not nearly enough. There's an assumption in Washington that Canada will always be there, always be friendly, always be willing to supply resources and cooperate on security matters. But assumptions are dangerous in geopolitics. Countries act in their own interests. And if Canadian leaders ever conclude that their interests are better served by diversifying away from American dependency, if they decide to strengthen ties with other powers or impose conditions on resource exports, the United States would find itself in an extremely vulnerable position. Think about it from Canada's perspective for a moment. They have a population of about 40 million people living next door to a superpower with more than 300 million people and the most powerful military in human history. That's an inherently asymmetric relationship, and it requires a delicate balance of cooperation and careful boundary setting. Canadians benefit enormously from American economic opportunities and security guarantees, but they also worry about being overwhelmed, about losing sovereignty, and about becoming so economically integrated that they lose the ability to make independent decisions. These aren't irrational concerns. They're legitimate questions about national identity and self-determination. And here's where American politicians and policymakers often make mistakes. There's sometimes an attitude of taking Canada for granted, of assuming that because we share a language and similar cultures and democratic values, the relationship will just naturally work itself out. But relationships require maintenance. They require respect. They require genuine partnership rather than domination. The trade relationship between the United States and Canada is the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, with goods and services worth over $900 billion crossing the border annually. That's not just impressive, it's unprecedented in human history. No two countries have ever been so economically intertwined while maintaining separate sovereignty and political systems. The USMCA trade agreement, which replaced NAFTA, governs much of this relationship, but agreements are only as good as the political will to maintain them. We've seen how quickly trade relationships can deteriorate when political leaders decide to use tariffs and trade restrictions as weapons. We've seen how economic nationalism can override rational economic policy. And if that kind of thinking ever seriously damaged the US-Canada economic relationship, both countries would suffer. But the United States might actually suffer more because of how dependent we've become on those Canadian resources and supply chains that I mentioned earlier. Jeffrey Sachs also points to another dimension that most people miss entirely, the moral and diplomatic dimension. In a world where American credibility and moral authority are constantly being questioned, where rivals and allies alike wonder whether the United States can be trusted to honor its commitments, the relationship with Canada serves as a kind of proof of concept. If America can't maintain a positive, mutually beneficial relationship with its closest ally and neighbor, a country with which it shares values and interests, what does that say about American reliability as a global partner? Canada has stood with the United States through countless international challenges, has supported American initiatives, even when doing so was politically unpopular at home, has committed troops to joint military operations, and accepted refugees from American-driven conflicts. That kind of loyalty and partnership is rare in international relations, and it deserves to be recognized and reciprocated rather than taken for granted. So where does all this leave us? The hidden truth is that American survival, not just prosperity, but actual survival as a modern functioning society, depends far more on Canada than most Americans realize or than most politicians are willing to admit. This isn't about being alarmist or exaggerating the threat. It's about recognizing reality and making policy decisions based on that reality rather than on outdated assumptions or political convenience. The energy that powers our lives, the water that sustains our cities, the minerals that enable our technology, the trade that enriches our economy, the security that protects our borders, all of these depend on a strong partnership with Canada.